Okay. So, my name is Jana Roschker, and I am from Ljubljana University, and I will, in the framework of this present of this little symposium or workshop, which is on the transcultural aspects or perspectives of political and ethical philosophy. I will try to introduce shortly a theory of the so-called theory of the two kinds of morality that was developed by Li Zehou. Now, before I go into the topic itself, I would like to shortly introduce Li Zehou himself and also his general theory in a few minutes, because I think that Li Zehou is not very well known to scholars who are not dealing with Chinese philosophy. So he is arguably one of the most influential contemporary philosophers in China, who passed away in November 2021. So in his lifetime, he has been one of China's most important or prominent philosophers, and he tried to transform Confucian philosophy into a resource for positive contemporary change. He has reinterpreted the tradition from earlier times down to the present day. From a critical reading of the Analects, rereading of the Analects, this is the most canonical work of Confucianism, to formulating his own aesthetic theory, which was immensely influential in China in the 60s and in the 70s, also in the 80s. In this effort, he has been inspired by Marx and Kant, but we must know that he is neither a Marxist nor is he Kantian, and he's also not a Confucian philosopher. He is simply an original. So, and he also, in contrast to many other of his contemporaries, who also worked in the field of philosophy, he really developed his own philosophical system, which he called anthropo-historical philosophy. So he uses Marx as a kind of starting point to re-examine and to re-evaluate some problems that were brought into life or that were exposed by Kant. And then he tries to deal with the problems arising from these considerations. So he tried to place these discourses into a broader framework that is closer to traditional Chinese philosophy, especially to to the works of Confucius and his followers. So, and these discourses were, in his view, strongly marked by the notion of pragmatic reason, or of the so-called pragmatic reason. So what is actually pragmatic reason? It refers to a form of rationality that is based upon practical human activity, especially labor, tool use, and social interactions. It was this kind of reason was not did not spring out from purely abstract formal logic alone. So pragmatic reason is a kind of reason that is historically and culturally mediated also. So this contrasts with both purely instrumental reason, which is focused only on efficiency, but also pure reason it contrasts with pure reason in the Kantian sense, which is completely detached from empirical life. So Li's pragmatic reason aligns closely with his focus on practice, and the shaping of subjectivity through everyday embodied and historical experiences. So if we try to place it now into the framework of Li Zehou's broader theory, we must see that it functions through the interaction of rational and emotional factors. This is, of course, important for the notion, and these rational and emotional factors, or the interaction between them, is seen as an equal part of the reason and emotions are seen as equal parts of the what he calls emotional rational structure, which is a kind of a form in the human mind. And this form is not a priori, not completely a priori, but also rooted in the reality, which is seen by Li Zehou as something which he calls emotion-based ontology of the emotion-based substance. Well, this notion of emotion, we must also understand it in a wider sense. The notion is connected to feelings, or to the feeling-based or empirical way of how human beings are reacting to the world, to the situations with which they are confronted or into which they are embedded. So in his view, the idea of emotional rational structure is a paradigmatic basis of the particular cultural psychological formation. And these kind of formations are also parts of the human consciousness, and they differ according to the culture, or according the same cultural psychological formation is, in his view, shared by people with the same historical, aesthetic, cultural, and linguistic background. So in this regard, we should mention his concept of the so-called subjectality. This is the ontological aspect of subjectivity, emphasizing the socially and historically formed agency of the individual. So the subject of subjectality is not merely able to think or to know, but can also act, work, invent, produce, congregate, cooperate, desire, feel, remember, and so on. So, yeah, and this is closely linked to this concept of subjectivity is closely linked to again to another central concept of Li's philosophical system. This is the concept of sedimentation, which refers to a historical psychological theory suggesting that rational, cultural, and aesthetic forms accumulate and persist over time within human consciousness. So the mental and spiritual formations established and stored in this process significantly differ from Kant's a priori form. So the main difference between Kant's a priori forms and these sedimented forms of Li Zehou's lies in their respective disposition. Because in contrast to Kant, Li Zehou sees these forms as dynamic and modifiable, although their modifications can sometimes be much too slow to be perceived by concrete human beings in their life span. So they seem as something which is more or less fixed, and thus it is easy to miscomprehend them as being a priori. Li distinguished between three basic levels of sedimentation. The largest one, which is on the bottom here in this schema, this is the fundamental layer. This is the layer that is almost always seen as a priori, as something fixed, because it changes in millennia of evolutional development. and we are just unable to perceive it as a kind of change. So this level includes universal forms that are common to all people. The second layer is narrower. It is the layer that is called by Li Zehou the layer of cultural sedimentation. And it consists of forms that are formed by specific thought and behavior patterns, linguistic structures, and other factors shared by people belonging to particular cultures. So this cultural psychological formation is part of this very level. Yeah, the third layer is the smallest one. It is called individual sedimentation and consists of our intimate worldviews, value systems, habits, emotions, as well as individual modes of thinking and feeling. So now let's proceed from this general description of Li Zehou's philosophy to his moral or ethical philosophy. So, because in his mature years, Li Zehou became increasingly interested in ethics and morality. So, in the first part of the life, it was more aesthetics. Well, in this sense, in his moral philosophy, he draws a clear and philosophically grounded distinction between ethics and morality, a distinction central to his interpretation of Chinese tradition and modernization, or the relation between tradition and modernization. So this is the summary. Here is the summary of this distinction. Ethics in Li Zehou's system, sorry, refers to external, socially instituted norms governing interpersonal behavior. So it is rooted in Confucian ritual culture, in family roles and social relations. It also functions as a structure of behavior expectations tied to roles within a community. It emphasizes social harmony, roles, social roles, and obligations that go together with these social roles. And it is not based on some kind of really inner or innate consciousness. Li sees it as a collective and sedimented, shaped historically over generations. So, and now let's proceed to morality. In Li Zehou's system, morality refers to moral autonomy and the individual's capacity for self-reflection and judgment. So in his philosophy, this inner dimension of human mind is influenced by Kant's philosophy, or by Kantian philosophy, especially by his idea of moral law, a kind of internal moral law, right? So it emerges with modernity, where individuals become moral agents beyond traditional roles. It focuses on consciousness, universal principles, and inner responsibility. Now let's take a look of how Li Zehou evaluates the role of ethics and morality in the Chinese philosophy. So in his view, a traditional Chinese philosophy emphasized ethics over morality, but in contemporary societies, in his view, we require a synthesis between both kinds of moralities, which preserves the relational ethics grounded in Confucianism, but is at the same time able to integrate the subjectivity and autonomy of modern morality. Yeah. So on this ground, he distinguishes between these two kinds of morality. And in his theory, he draws a clear demarcation line between the religious morality, which is associated with subjective emotions, values, and beliefs on the one hand, and then on the other hand, between social morality, which is linked to justice, equality, reason, independence, human rights, and so on. So, in this schema, modern social morality and public virtue are distinguished from religious morality and private virtue. For Li, the former, so this social morality, of course, is primary. And he often emphasizes that religious morality stems from social morality. Religious morality pertains to the religious nature of private virtues or private religious morality, and is embedded in individual values that originate from subjective feelings and develop through inherent cultivation and beliefs. Social morality, on the other hand, is rooted in public social virtues that are adopted as products of external laws, ethical codes, regulations, and orders. So we should here, in this point, we should shortly mention also that Li, beside distinguishing between these two kinds of morality, Li also distinguishes between two kinds of ethics, which stand in analogous relations to the two kinds of morality. He points out that this differentiation is particularly important in the present times, right? Because first, ethics appears as a part of political philosophy, in which it mainly deals with various problems of human rights, justice, and the structure of social power, and so on. But it also often occurs in the framework of religious philosophy, in which it is mainly connected to questions regarding the concept of goodness. And we will shortly go into this differentiation between right and good, or righteousness and goodness later on, but we will not deal in detail with these two kinds of ethics, because the distinction between these two kinds of morality is much more important, for it has a paradigmatic rather than merely a discursive value. So in this presentation, and due to the time limitations, I will, of course, primarily deal with this distinction between the two kinds of morality. And now let's try to place this distinction between these two kinds of morality into Li Zehou's general scheme of ethics and morality. So we must know that morality always refers to individual psychological forms, because these forms are, but these forms, the individual innate moral forms, are additionally subdivided into an internal and external realms, and these two kinds of morality are actually a part of the external sphere of this inner part. So if I try to explain this a bit more in detail, as we have seen, morality is different from ethics or legislation, which enforces restrictions upon individuals from outside. In Li's system, morality manifests itself in internal control, which enables a person's reasoning to suppress and to overcome her individual desires, selfish interest, inclinations and instincts, and which leads her to act in accordance with social norms. Li sees this rational guidance and control as a specific human ability, which came to life through what he called condensation or solidification of reason, a part of sedimentation, which is, as we will see in Chinese cultures, very tightly linked to rituality. So this solidification of reason comes about or is shaped by the implementation of rituality. So morality always refers to individual psychological forms. So in Li's system, these forms are additionally subdivided, as already mentioned, into an internal and external realm. So while the former, the internal realm of this internal part consists of mental forms of reason and emotions, mental forms of reason like concepts, ideas, free will, and so on. So reason and emotion, we have here forms of reasons and emotions. And the external dimension, on the other hand, consists of two kinds of morality in question. These two kinds of morality. So these two axiological categories are thus embedded into the external realm of the inner individual moral world, which belongs to, of course, cultural historical formations and is therefore, again, historically shaped and socially determined, although on the first glimpse it could appear as something unchangeable and a priori. So, as already mentioned, Li emphasizes that the fundamental axiological basis of modern societies must rest on social morality, which is rooted in public reason and therefore of primary value. This is also concretely and fundamentally linked to the fact that we must not harm, we mustn't in any case harm individual rights. In spite of this high reciprocity of this high evaluation of traditional Chinese social models that were based on relationism and mutual complementarity of humaneness, Li emphasizes that in modern ages, individual existence is the groundwork of the existence of society as a whole. So individual rights cannot be invaded. In other words, the idea of the priority of the social over the religious morality is the foundation of modern life. In this context, Li Zehou highlights the importance of a modern legal system and the properly determinable concept of justice. Li acknowledges that in spite of the problematic dimension inherent to rational principles, these principles are still to be considered as great contributions of the European Enlightenment, and I cannot but agree with this claim. So, but on the other hand, Li Zehou emphasizes that the religious morality serves in this framework only as a regulative principle. So, social morality is a constitutive principle, and religious morality is a regulative principle. So public education must also be based on modern social morality. In such a system, individuals can, of course, still freely decide on their beliefs and on their private virtues. They are still free to choose their private virtues, values, and beliefs, and to follow their own private religious morality, which is part of human emotion-based substance, and therefore it is not unimportant, of course. So Li firmly believes in the significance of such complementary roles of religious morality and private virtue. For it can fill up the axiological and emotional value. Axiological and emotional vacuum, which dominates the alienated contemporary societies. So Li Zehou claims that, that private virtues are important because they can alleviate the emotional vapidity and coldness of human relationships brought about by mechanistic public reason, formal justice, brought about the market economy, fair trade, and the, of course, atomic individual. However, Li Zehou repeatedly emphasizes that faith and emotion contained and constituted in this religious morality can merely function as regulative and properly constitutive principles. This means that they are necessarily unable to determine or even replace modern social morality and public reason on which this modern social morality is grounded. So the proper constitution of religious morality is of great value for a society of true humaneness, provided that it cannot harm or deviate from the principles of social morality. For these principles have an absolute priority. So in such a correlative schema, of course, in which the two kinds of morality complement each other, the model of human relations is not reduced to a static and fixed system of that is determined by some kind of immovable rules, but rather functions as a vibrant interhuman network that is able to diminish the social gap between rich and poor, surpassing the static model of stagnant social classes. So, on the other hand, Li Zehou also relates these two kinds of morality to the traditional Chinese model of the binary category of the so-called inner sage and external ruler. This binary category refers to two aspects or two parts of the human self. The external ruler refers to those parts of us, of the human self, who are concerned with politics, with institutions, with political activity, also with interhuman relations in the broadest sense, but also in a more narrower sense, so interpersonal, interhuman relations and politics. So it refers to the empirical self, to those parts of our human self that are connected to our living in the immanent world. The inner sage, this is the external ruler, right? The inner sage, the second part of this double category, refers to those parts of the human self that are concerned with self-cultivation, with moral development, with cultivation of values and virtues and so on. So the external ruler refers to the empirical self, and the inner sage refers to the transcendental self. So, in such view, in Li's view, the inner sage symbolizes and incorporates religious morality. So, according to Li, this notion can assist people through philosophy, religion, art, and literature, and so on, in their search for meaning and the spiritual realms of life. But the external ruler On the other hand, the external ruler stands for public virtues and symbolizes social morality. So this concept is important as a foundation of a reasonable, just, and democratic political system. Li tries to develop this traditional binary category by upholding a new way, sorry, a new way of the inner sage and external ruler, in which they are complementary. And because in Chinese tradition, there was always an exaggeratedly intense focus on individual cultivation of private values. So on this religious morality. So the inner sageousness could never transform itself or advance straight to the outer rule. However, the current postmodern globalized world is governed by instrumental rationality, and this external ruler should be supplemented by the internal sage, namely the ancient Chinese model of self-cultivation. So in this context, the traditional religious morality could be revived in order to supplement the domination of global reason, but would at the same time not be allowed, as it was the case in traditional China, to become a dominant model of ruling by virtue. Right? So, in this context, it is maybe important to note that according to Li Zehou, religious morality of traditional China originated from the shamanistic ceremonies of the clan-based societies of the Neolithic era. These ceremonies were based on the so-called ritual ethics and shaped the traditional Chinese codes of conduct and modes of life over thousands of years. So these shamanistic ceremonies were later integrated or formed the basis for the Confucian kind of rituality, which, on the other hand, was, of course, the basis of the what he called solidification or a condensation of reason. Yeah. So Li highlights that in ancient, traditional, and pre-modern China, people were convinced and they truly believed that this ritual ethics had a universal nature which surpassed time and space. So this ritually determined system of ceremonial codes became the religious morality of the Chinese people. In the human mind, these ritualized patterns contain the sprouts of intellectual activity, while at the same time allowing for the expression of feelings. In his book, From Shamanism to Rituality, explaining rituality as a return to humaneness, Li describes this development in the following way. He says, in this process of rationalization, all kinds of activities that originally only served as intermediaries or tools for performing shamanistic ceremonies became symbolic systems and operators. They were increasingly objectivized, and recorded, but still contained strong emotion and beliefs like fear, respect, loyalty, and honesty. So these kinds of feelings and faiths and beliefs became the most important foundations for the establishment of and spread of Confucian moral virtues and values. Because the shamanistic rituals were a form of the unity of human beings with the spirits, they were not venerating any objectified external deities, any gods, but could be perceived as a sensual experience of the inherent, and were also inseparable from them. Li exposes that in such a union, there was no room for any transcendence or for any objectively existing God. So in this procedure of rationalization of the shamans, who were originally spiritual or religious leaders, progressively also became ethical and political leaders, right? So according to Li, this is also the main reason or the source of the tripartite nature of Confucianism, in which religion, ethics, and politics are amalgamated into a coherent and inseparable unity. However, he is convinced that this union of politics, ethics, and religion, which is still widespread in modern and contemporary Chinese societies, that this union needs to be changed in order to achieve a Chinese style of separation of religion and state. And in this context, he also criticizes all the other streams of thought that were not aware of how important this differentiation between religious and social morality is. So the first stream of thought he criticizes in this context are the so-called modern New Confucians. This is a neoconservative stream of thought that tried to that aimed to modernize, to revive and modernize certain Confucian concepts that could then, as such, as in their modernized form, serve as a foundation of a specifically Chinese mode of modernization of modern societies. So modernization would not be further equated with Westernization. So, but he sharply criticizes this stream of thought for taking the contemporary requirement for fulfilling individual desires, which in fact belongs to the individual-based liberalism, as the basis of traditional Chinese unity of self and the objects or of the great spiritual self. So also in the view of modern New Confucians, this great spiritual self should still envelop this individual-based liberalism and modify it to become a part of the inherent relation. So such ideas in Li Zehou's view overlook, ignore the huge discrepancies and basic contradictions between these two approaches. They just didn't work with this distinction between the two kinds of morality, and therefore they were on the not on the right way. But the same, but a very similar critique was also directed against the opposite stream of thought. These were the advocates of complete Westernization. They also failed to establish a functioning complementary model of social and religious morality. They wanted to establish only modern social morality, which was completely taken from the West, and their theories and their propaganda additionally contributed, in Li's view, to the muddling of these two kinds of morality. For instance, already in 1919, with establishment or with the development of the so-called May 4th movement, this was a cultural, large cultural and very influential cultural movement that has determined China's attitude towards modernization. The proponents of the Fourth May movement were actually also proponents of more or less complete Westernization of the Chinese society in order to allow for the conditions of for China to modernize itself. But their social morality, which was, of course, concerned with human rights, democracy, and libertarianism, and which was supposed to be value neutral, became part of their anti-traditional stance. So it was not value neutral, it was openly and concretely anti-traditional. So the representatives of this movement have made it a part of an ideology and a part of religious morality. So they were in their complete neglection or negation of tradition. They have developed an ideologization or the ideological misuse of this tradition to the extent that it became a very dogmatist religious morality. So they were against religious morality, but they formed their own religious morality, and therefore they contributed to the modeling of these two kinds of morality as such. So in principle, Li certainly believes that modern China should restore rationality, by which he, in contrast to modern Confucian philosophers like Mao Zedong, did not imply that it should reconstruct any kind of transcendental, but rather a pragmatic reason, the notion developed by himself. He believes that the revival of paradigmatic cultural values will prevent China's transformation into a pure market society, which is based upon a commercialized culture entirely ruled, of course, by material desires. So by applying the revived and modernized complementary model of the new way, what he called new way of the inner sage and external ruler, in which they should complement each other, a spontaneous regulation of these unlimited desires and inclinations could become possible without rigidly constraining human desires through religions or ideologies of guilt. So Li emphasizes that it is important for Chinese people to revive their own traditional culture of pleasure, which rested on a complementary equilibrium of reason and emotions. So this equilibrium of reason and emotion is also reflected in all other segments of reality. So such ideas could also function for the construction of alternative models of morality, preventing the absolute domination of liberal standards, which prevail in contemporary, especially in Western society. So Li advocates the use of what he called the substantive justice. So in certain situations, his theory of two moralities also includes the infiltration of such a kind of justice. So this justice is not based on, like for instance, modern legislation on fixed, normatively fixed determination that is the basis of concrete laws and regulations, but on a dynamic normativity, which is changeable in accordance to concrete situations with which we are dealing. So in this sense, he would also like to apply and to revive certain Chinese ethical concepts that could be amalgamated or integrated into the modern ethical system in the way that they would allow for a more situational flexibility in the normative framework of society. So such as, for instance, the concept ching, which is translated as emotion, but this translation is somehow problematic because the concept ching, but there is no better translation, I must confess. But the context ching is very situational, and it refers more to our human responsiveness to what we are confronted with in concrete situations. Then also Confucian relationality as such. This is an ethical system in which the human self is constituted not as a pure abstract separated individual, independent individual, but the human self is something that is constituted psychologically also through the relations of which they are part. So then also the emotional rational structure, which was mentioned before already, or the concept of do. This is a specific Chinese kind of grasping the proper measure. So this situational flexibility should, in Li's view, be integrated into this complementary relation between public and private virtues, between modern social and traditional religious morality. So this could help, in his view, implement the regulation and proper ethical constitution of contemporary societies, and could also guide societies through virtue rather than mere utilitarian categories of benefit, free choice, and other values serving market rather than people. But when referring to the values and basic paradigms of liberalism, Li also points out that Chinese and Western societies differ in their social development and in their respective cultural traditions. So it is thus not a coincidence that in their histories they also established different ideas on morality and virtue ethics, with Aristotle and Christianity on the one side, and traditional Chinese virtues or Confucian virtue ethics on the other side. So here it is important to note that the relationship between the constitutive principles of modern social morality on the one hand and the regulative ones of the traditional religious morality is always historically concrete and shaped in accordance with the material circumstances and conditions determining the distinct society in question. Neither moral values nor social or political rights are composed of any a priori principles, because both are clearly products of history. So this is really a very important part of Li's philosophy, which is processual in nature. But Li also exposes that the axiological standards or central criteria applied by the two kinds of morality are different. So in this sense, now to conclude, we should also expose this differentiation we have already mentioned before between the concepts of rightfulness and the concepts of goodness. So the modern social morality is based upon what is right, namely upon a domination of public reason that ought to be accorded with in modern social life. In contrast to this platform, traditional religious morality in existing religions, traditions, cultures, and ideologies mainly rely on the concept of goodness. Although what is right is often equated with what is good. He emphasizes that these two concepts need to be distinguished from one another because in numerous cultures, what is right or wrong differs significantly from what is good or evil. Li Zehou sees the neutrality of values as an important constituent of modern societies, but for him, right does not necessarily have to rely on any particular tradition or traditional or tradition or present or any particular present concept of good or goodness. But of course, the neutrality of values as such is a very dangerous concept. So, as regards the numerous problems and excesses arising from value neutrality, the danger of which Li Zehou is obviously aware of, he thinks that this can be dealt with through making judgments and decisions according to what is rationally and emotionally appropriate, according to particular situation. Okay, so this is kind of a weakness, I think, in Li Zehou's theory of the two kinds of morality, because he never successfully or solidly argues who or what would be the instance, the arbitrary instance that would judge or that would determine what is rationally and emotionally appropriate in a certain situation. So this is a very important factor that just misses that is necessary and which is missing here in this theory. But nevertheless, I will now conclude with Li's opinion that on the basis of the emotional rational structure which prevailed in the social consciousness of the Chinese cultures, these judgments made in concrete situations could be more balanced and just. Li thinks that taking into account human emotion, as Confucianism did, coupled with psychological considerations that were also important in the Chinese tradition, and with its desire to maintain people's inherent connection with the world, can definitely expand contemporary social morality and provide alternative platforms, alternative opinions or suggestions for its improvement. He believes that approaches based on the theory of the two types of morality provide good methods to combine the Chinese tradition, or any tradition, in fact, with contemporary political philosophical investigations that seek a separation of church and state. And with this opinion, which can be discussed, of course, I will now conclude my presentation, and thank you for listening.